Hi, welcome to our focus on English for specific purposes for police. So just like with the last unit, we will spend 2 weeks on this topic, and this is our last chance to kind of think through a case, think through an issue, think through a specific kind of English together as a group. Where you go after this is onto your own case, your own situation. Some of you will be heading off to analyze the language of tour guides, because the country that you have in mind of eventually teaching English, tour guiding is a really big, important part of the economy, and it's a way that you could immediately find a job for yourself. Others might be headed to working in English for hotels, English for restaurants, English for taxi drivers. We have a small group prepared to create English for baristas for Starbucks, who is devoted to hiring refugees, a large number of refugees over the next few years. So we've got all of that, and then we have a couple of you doing some individualized projects as well. So my goal with this case is for us to really, and for me to help you with it, to grab every single bit of learnable kind of takeaway we can get. And so today my focus is on language, and next week the focus will be on pedagogy, so on designing those activities, making choices about things. Now, with ESP, I'm sure you see that language and pedagogy are so closely tied together. It's almost impossible to talk about one without talking about the other. And even though I'm focusing on language today, I am going to end up talking about pedagogy as well. But today, when we talk about this case, and it's in your ESP book, okay, and I believe it is, let's see what chapter it is. I don't know. Maybe chapter 5. Yeah, it looks like it's chapter 5. Chapter 5, English for Police. As we talk through it today, I want to talk a little bit about kind of some big picture pieces that you'll see when you get to the case. And then, of course, I want to talk about language. And within the lesson today, I'm actually going to do a mini lesson on how to teach pronunciation. After you finish watching this lecture, I would like you to read chapter 5 in the textbook, and hopefully this lecture really brings it alive for you and makes it easy to make it through. And then you'll find 2 types of links waiting for you in our module. One set is just kind of about some sites that I found that are about the language of police in general, and the types of learning activities that you might find useful for your own students in the future. And the other type of link is entirely devoted to pronunciation. There are some fantastic pronunciation books out there, and but I also wanted you to see there are lots of resources, some better than others, about pronunciation online. And so I have found some of those, I'm recommending them, and I've placed them in your module so you can take a look. So what we have in this case that we're looking at in chapter 5 this week is we have a case of English for specific purposes professionals creating a course, or ultimately a few courses, specifically for those who were in the process of becoming police. And so in this case, one of the things I wanted you to notice is that the case begins with the story of one person, someone who's a native Japanese speaker and who was living in the country, I think it's New Zealand, and was just determined to become the first police person of Japanese descent to be on the force in this community, and kept trying and kept failing. And there were 2 things that were holding him back. One was a fitness test that he had to pass, and the second was around language. His language, his English was not there yet. And he knew his case actually caught the eye of a reporter. It was sucked up into the news. And what he reported is he knew what to do about the fitness challenge. He was working on that. He had no idea what to do about the English challenge. And so I think it's really important to kind of notice this is yet another way that these ESP courses get started. Someone who has an idea about how to design specific purposes courses sees something in the newspaper and pulls together some resources and possibly comes up with a response. You know, a great example, a local example, is my having read about Starbucks' commitment to hire 10,000 refugees in the U.S. over the next 5 years, and realizing that there are implications for a very specific kind of English there. And throwing it out to the group, and 3 of you so far saying, I want to do that. That's the project I want to take on. So sometimes things start with one person. Sometimes things get sucked up into the news, and that becomes its own course. So just kind of another way to notice, how do these things get started? So that one person might be you. It might be you reading a headline or meeting someone on the bus in Costa Rica or wherever and coming up with the idea and doing it. So, but I also wanted to point out another aspect of this case, and that is that when this person who wanted to be a police person, when he was determined to do this, it matched up with a societal move, which was that the community wanted the police force to more closely match who the community was. And there was a lot of diversity in the community, but not very much diversity on the police force. And so this ESP course, rather than just helping this one person, actually joined part of a bigger movement to help the community kind of right itself in terms of social justice. And I have the word equity up here. If you've already taken ESLG 489, which is offered every fall, you've already encountered this word, and you've probably, even if you haven't taken the course, you've encountered it in some way. And one of the things we do in that course is we show the difference, we talk about the difference between equality and equity. Equality is when you believe what is fair is to treat everyone the same. And equity is when what you believe is fair is to give each person the resources they need to respond to the challenges that they specifically face. And so this is a great example, this ESP course is a great example of one community's movement towards equity, because English often will be a barrier that non-native speakers of English face when attempting to join a profession. And so I just wanted to point out that just by taking this course, just preparing yourself to teach ESP, if you are up for the challenge, you are very ready to play a very important part in social justice, in helping the world kind of right itself in terms of who has access to opportunity and who doesn't. Because by teaching an ESP course, you are leveling the language playing field. And so wherever you go in your career, you can make a huge difference. So I hope you enjoy that challenge in your career. And thank you in advance for what you'll be able to do with that. So that's a piece that I really wanted to pull out. It doesn't specifically only focus on language, but it's a really important part of this case. Another thing that I wanted to point out is that this is yet another case where the people who were designing and then teaching the course knew absolutely nothing at the beginning about police work. Maybe a couple of them have been pulled over for speeding tickets a few times, like me. But other than that, they really had not much knowledge. And yet, they did it. They were successful. So one thing that in our discussions, we've been kind of thinking about, chewing on, trying to see which way we felt about it is it ultimately important that a professional, an ESP teacher has access to that professional knowledge even before they start to think about designing the course? So in other words, if you're teaching ESP for those who work in hotels, is it important that you at some point worked in hotels yourself? And I'm hoping that this is another example that you can kind of enter into your evidence that says, absolutely not, it's not necessary. What is necessary is an amazing needs analysis. And I might even, I'm going to throw out there, I think I've kind of hinted at this a few times in our course, but it is very, very possible that if you are coming into designing an ESP course or teaching an ESP course in a profession that you know nothing about, you might actually do a better job. Why? Because you know you need to carry out a very thorough needs analysis. If someone's previous career was in that profession, my guess is they're going to base a lot of their decisions around just instinct and what they remember. And we've already seen some examples of things change, right? And there's reason to keep up with what a community specifically wants or what a community wants now. And so there's another piece of evidence there that it's okay not to have experience in the profession before you design that course and teach in it. And this is a narrow angle or narrow focus course. I forget which way your book calls it. Narrow angle, I think, is what it calls. And remember, those are really important terms for you to keep in mind, for you to use, whether or not you actually say them out loud with other people you're working in ESP with. But it's really important for you to keep in mind when a course you're designing or teaching in is narrow angle or wide angle. What's the difference? It was a few chapters ago in our book. And basically narrow angle is when you can be incredibly focused because everybody in your class is in the same profession and they are all in the same situation in the profession. Maybe they are all recruits or they are all, they've all had at least 2 years of experience teaching or working rather. And they're all working maybe at the same restaurant or the same hotel. And that's in the same community. And so there's a lot of information. You don't have to say, okay, for those in the back, this is what's true. For those in the front, this is what's true. Rather, you can meet everyone's needs with the same activities. And that is a narrow angle course. And that's what this is as well. There's only one spot in this case in which probably things become a little more wide angle, and that has to do with where students. There's a certain point for police at which they choose a specialty, so they have to keep going for more schooling. We'll talk about that in a moment. And as they do, they have to choose a specialty. What is it that they want to learn more about? And so suddenly you have this group in the same community, the same police agency, they're all in the same stage of learning, and then at a certain point they differentiate. And so at that point, if they were still teaching the course, still receiving the course, it would not be narrow focus anymore. It'd be a little more wide angle. Okay. And another thing I wanted you to notice about the case, and this comes up fairly soon in the chapter, where you will see lists of all the different ways that information was gathered. Let me grab some of those to point those out. Pages 72 and 73 in your book, the bottom of 72 and then on to most of 73. And one thing I wanted you to notice is there was kind of a two-tiered or two-stage needs analysis, and maybe even later in the chapter it looks like there was even a third stage as well. And one reason I want to point that out to you is that often when you are assigned, or you assign yourself, to learn more about a profession so you can design an ESP course, you don't really know all that you need to gather, and you don't know what you don't know. So you get in there, you start gathering information, and that points at other pieces of data that you need to gather. So one thing I wanted to point out is that is not failure. That's not a sign that you didn't plan well enough from the beginning. That's simply points that you are slowly unraveling this puzzle. And so keep in mind that when you do needs analysis for ESP, it might be 2-tiered or 2-stage. It might be 3-stage. It might be 4-stage. That's a sign of your perseverance and you're being very careful in your needs analysis. It's not a sign of failure. So, so while we're on it, on pages 72 and 73, in the first stage of the needs analysis, the group who was designing the course, the ESP teachers, they were going to meetings with police. And some of those meetings were, I think, not exactly formal meetings. It was more like getting caught in the hallway and maybe taken into a room and someone saying, maybe even off the record, you know, my real concern is this. And so there were lots of formal, and I'm taking it from the chapter, informal meetings as well, in which they were getting lots of information about what the stakeholders at the police station wanted to see. And they were also making visits to the police college. So this is essentially the place where those learning to be police were receiving coursework. And they observed a writing class. They observed a presentation being given in one of the courses. And of course, it makes sense that they might even have said, could we come on a day that we're seeing how they're taught to write? Can we come on a day when we're seeing a model of how it is that you want police to be able to present? And so even their choices around which classes to visit were probably directed by their need to analyze the language. They also were given many, many different written documents and texts that they were able to take a look at. And it turned out there was a lot of writing. We'll talk about that more in just a moment, but there's a lot of writing that the police are required to carry out. They also did some interviews with supervisors, and they did some ride-alongs. And of course, here what a ride-along means is you actually get into the car with a police person or two, and you go along with them for their daily shift or their evening shift. And probably there was a lot of note-taking, a lot of questions that were asked. And then with the participants themselves, they asked those who were eligible for or who desired to be a part of this course or who were pointed out as someone who should be a part of the course, they gave them a standardized language measurement. It doesn't say which one, but somehow they were trying to get a gauge on, and most standardized language measurements, they're either all 4 skills or they are reading and listening and sometimes writing as well. So it's unclear what kind of language measurement was happening. And they also had the participants do self-assessment. And I think a few discussions ago this came up as very important to several of you, that we include for our participants, those who are going to be our students, we find out from them what is it that they want to know. And that, of course, is on the needs analysis template that I created for you. And then they also did some pilot assessments. They don't say what those were. If it were me, and at this point I had already seen that that police have to present certain information at times and that they need to do lots of writing. If it were me, I would probably have had students take turns one by one, come in, give me a presentation. I would be listening and taking notes. I might not necessarily have a rubric at that point because I might not know exactly what I'm listening for, but I would be taking lots of notes on what do I notice, what's clear, what's not clear, what suggestions can I think of for the student. And then also for writing, because at this point we know, at this point in the case, we know already that there's a lot of writing that police have to carry out. So I would probably assign them a prompt and just see, that's kind of like the kind of writing that they might have to do for a report, and see what kind of language I get. See how mechanics are, spelling, word choice, grammar, that sort of thing, and how much fluency they have. What does fluency mean? How much they're able to write. If you gave everyone in the room 30 minutes to write, and a few of the students were only able to write maybe 1 or 2 sentences, then you definitely have a fluency issue. Okay. So all of that I just described, that was the first tier. So what was in the second tier? In the second tier, they were taking a look at what does the language look like that police actually use on the job. So they studied exchanges between police and the public. So if they, for example, pull someone like me over for a moving violation, what does that discussion look like? What does that communication look like? What do the exchanges look like between police officers themselves? And what does it look like, or what should it look like when police give evidence in court? Because going to court is something that police often have to do. So that was in their second tier of analysis, and there's even more needs analysis that happens later in the chapter, including they watch a program that's a lot like Cops in the U.S., where news reporters, or I should say kind of cameramen and people who are videographers, they go along with police for their daily or their nightly rounds in a ride-along, and they film what happens. And then that becomes, all of that footage comes together from that day or from that evening and makes up an episode. So they actually watch that too, and I think that's interesting, and we're going to draw upon that later in this unit. We'll do a little something with that. So that's another element that I really want to focus on, is that it's okay if your needs analysis takes a lot of stages. That's okay. Okay, so what I want to talk about next is I want to talk about that as they were doing this needs analysis, they discovered that there really were 2, and then we're going to break it up into 3 different kinds of English that police have to use. There's the on-the-job English, so talking with other police, talking with the public, presenting evidence, and writing reports. So there were all those different elements of English that need to be used on the job. But there's also an academic component as well. And at first when they talk about this in the chapter, they just talk about academics, so that the students that would be in this course, they also were still students. And so they needed support with the English they needed in their other courses to be successful. But then that gets broken up as well into 2 different types of academic work. One is to become a police person, and the other is to keep moving up as a police person. In other words, once you become a police person, to keep your job or to move up in your job, you need to continue to take more coursework. And as you take this coursework, you're kind of choosing specialties that you want to be especially informed about and ready to act on. And so there were these 2 very different kinds of uses, and really 3 very different kinds of uses. And one thing I wanted to highlight about this is you're very likely to encounter this as well in your ESP teaching. If you, for example, are hired to work with daycare providers who are providing daycare in English, and their first language, all of them, their first language is not English, there is the language that they need to talk with the parents, the language that they need to talk with the children, the language that they need to fill out maybe a daily report, or to take notes on which children ate which foods, or any allergic reactions, that kind of thing, incident reports. But in most professions, there's some kind of process to recertify yourself or to stay certified. And even for daycare providers, if they're not taking a yearly course and recertifying, then they will lose their job. And so it's very likely that there will be this other element, the academic element, that you are responding to in terms of the needs of your students in your classes. Okay, So as we think about what they found through their needs analysis about language, one of the things that they discovered was that pronunciation was an issue. And it wasn't across the board an issue, but rather it was especially an issue when the students were tense, when they were under stress, and when they were having to speak quickly, which unfortunately is probably a lot of police work when you think about it. When you're talking with the public, often someone is upset about something. When you're giving evidence in court, you might, the opposing attorney might have some very difficult and kind of stressful questions for you, might actually question your own authority as a police person. And it's, from my understanding from this chapter, there is so much writing that police have to carry out. I bet a lot of the writing too has to happen very quickly. And so if between even police officers, if they have to talk through something before they write it, even that kind of conversation might be slightly stressed and having to be more fluent. So let's talk for a moment about how do you approach pronunciation in ESP? And I think we already know from looking at pedagogy that it is very likely that pronunciation belongs in your ESP course, but only when it's called for, right? Only when it's absolutely necessary. So let's first talk about what are the kinds of issues that can come up in pronunciation. The first kind of issue that I think probably your mind naturally goes to are specific sounds in English that a student can't say, or that a student confuses with another sound. For example, some very typical sounds that are easily confused in English: L and R, B and V, P and B, the E sound and the S sound. All of those are easily confused, and it has to do with the phonetic systems that students know from their first language and they bring with them and they attempt to apply to English. So that's usually what's going on. So what would you do, for example, if you could see that students were confusing sounds, or every time a P sound was needed, a student is pronouncing that sound, and every time a B sound is needed, they're pronouncing the P as well. So in other words, they're replacing all the B sounds, the B sound, with P. What would you do? Well, minimal pairs are where you want to go. What's a minimal pair? A minimal pair are two words that the only difference between them is one sound, right? Like men and man, pin and pen, sheep and ship. Those are all examples of minimal pairs. And the reason that they matter is because what they can do for you is to help you show your students that these two sounds that they are confusing in some way are actually different and they're important in English. In other words, if you don't distinguish between these two sounds, someone listening to you will not know which. Do you mean there's a ship here or there's a sheep here, right? We don't know. Are you saying that there are men in the next room or a man in the next room? We don't know. And so the first thing that you need to do is to show your students through minimal pairs that there's a difference between these sounds in English and that they matter. And remember, whenever you're asking for students to change their pronunciation, you have to begin with their ear. If they can't pronounce it, they can't hear it. And so you start with minimal pairs, you train the ear. And after you watch this lecture, you read the chapter, you look at the links about the language of police work, in the pronunciation material that I've left there for you, you will find a nice list. It's not a huge list. It doesn't cover all the problematic sounds in English, but it's a really nice list of minimal pairs and even some activities that you could carry out with minimal pairs. So you need to help your students hear the difference, see the difference, and then to begin to produce the difference. And there's some ideas of ways to do that. Now, keep in mind that these students for the police, they need to be able to do it very quickly. So minimal pairs are great. They're a great starting place. They only get you so far. A police person doesn't pull someone over and walk up to them and say, man, men, men, man, right? They say a complete sentence, and they say it with meaning, and it's part of a bigger idea. And so you would want to create activities, and there are lots online, or you can always contact me for ideas, activities in which students are expressing meaning to each other, but it's within sentences, and they have to be able to differentiate between those two sounds, to be able to produce them, to be able to hear the difference. And so that would be a really important piece. So individual phonemes, that is a place where pronunciation might be an issue. Another place that students might encounter issues are around consonant clusters. In English, we often have two consonants together. Even the word cluster starts with a consonant cluster of two, CL, cla, cla. But we often have three together as well. Let's see, stripe, S-T-R, stripe. That's a consonant cluster of three. Other languages, for example, Polish, can put four together. We can't go there. But there's a lot of languages around the world that have no consonant clusters at all. To my knowledge, Japanese has no consonant clusters at all. So my guess is the original student who started this whole case, if he shows up in that first ESP class and they're working on pronunciation, I can guarantee you that consonant clusters needs to be a part of what's being taught. And so how do you teach consonant clusters? Well, there's a list of lots of words that have consonant clusters in them in your modules, but it doesn't have any ideas on ways to work on them. One thing that really works well are what are called backwards buildups. So let's say that a student is struggling with saying stripe, putting those three consonants together. So start with the last one, ripe. Make sure everyone can pronounce that, ripe. Okay, now add the T. Tripe, tripe. Now add the S. Stripe, stripe. So you can do backwards buildups to get them to be able to pronounce it. Another thing you can do is to take two words and see if when you put the end of one word with the beginning of the next word, that forms a consonant cluster. So let's see, I'm trying to think of an example. I can't think of an example. I'll put one online. But you could kind of have students, just like with the backward buildup, take two words where the end of this word and the beginning of this word form a consonant cluster, and slowly say the words faster and faster and faster, so they're creeping together so that they form the consonant cluster that way. So there's lots of different activities that you can do like that. Another issue around pronunciation that can come up is around word stress and relatedly sentence stress. What does that mean? Word stress means, in English, when we have a two-syllable word like police, one of the syllables is louder than the other. And so, for example, for nouns that are two syllables, one syllable will always be louder than the other. And so there are lots and lots of lists of rules that you can look at to kind of learn yourself how this works, which syllable is louder. And there are lots of prefixes, suffixes, that when you add them to words, they determine which syllable gets the stress. And so lots and lots of ways that you can learn about that and then practice those with your students. And with pronunciation, always, as I've mentioned, it always starts with the ear. So you would want to share with your students that you want them to listen for which syllable is louder, and maybe have a list of words on the board, and as you say each one, say it naturally, don't overemphasize the stress, and then see if they can start to hear which syllables are louder or not. And what we tend to do in English is we tend to use, we put over the stress syllable, we tend to put kind of a big black dot and for the loud part. So for example, academic, this is the stress syllable, ac-a-dem-ic. So that's, that word has 4 syllables, and it's the 3rd syllable that is the loudest. And probably, if we were to look up the rules, it's probably related to this ending, ic. And so you can learn about those, you can get your students hearing them, and you can teach them rules. Word stress in English is one of the few places where we actually have rules that you can grab onto and believe. And so, so there's lots of ways that you can teach them about what those rules are and then to practice them. And again, we need these students being able to use their pronunciation very fluently, under stress, very naturally. And so you would want as quickly as possible to embed those words into real sentences that police have to say. So having them, for example, doing role plays, and maybe you have a list of words up on the board, and environmental print, you have them marked which syllable is the loudest, and you might do whatever you need to kind of draw that attention to it. And you've got people doing role plays of maybe just a normal interaction that a police person might have with someone, a member of the public, and maybe every role play they have to use 6 of the words that are up on the board. And so starting to get them into everyday use in that way. And sentence stress, relatedly, sentence stress is, in English, not all of our words get the same stress, get the same amount of time, and not all of our words get kind of the same kind of emphasis in what we're saying. Whoops, hold on. Okay. Sorry, I must be standing too still, so now all the lights have gone off. And so an example that I often use, you might even have heard me use this example already. In English, we stress nouns and verbs. In general, nouns and verbs. So we spend longer on nouns and verbs, and we actually time our sentences according to nouns and verbs. Mice eat cheese. Mice eat cheese. Now, what happens if I start adding prepositions, other words, articles? What happens then? Well, you tell me. Listen, mice eat cheese. The mice eat cheese. The mice will eat the cheese. The mice will have eaten the cheese. Hopefully what you can hear is that I'm not changing the beats. Mice eat cheese gets exactly the same amount of emphasis because they're nouns and verbs, but all those other sounds, they get just kind of stuffed in there. And they're very brief, they're very difficult for a non-native speaker to hear. And so one thing that you could do, a really, really helpful resource for the police students might be, is to come up with lists of sentences from your ride-alongs that you've heard police say over and over again. What's that functional language? And helping them predict which words are going to be the loudest and the longest and get that beat. And then to practice saying them. And then as quickly as possible to go to authentic dialogues, that kind of thing. So there are resources waiting for you in your module. They're not perfect, but they're a good place to start about teaching pronunciation. And as well as there's even a diagnostic for you. There's a diagnostic packet, and on page 3, it's a reading passage. It contains all the sounds of English, all the consonant clusters, all the intonation patterns, word stress patterns. And so if you are going to diagnose someone's pronunciation, you might want to think about using a passage like this. You have them read it many times while you take notes, or just have them read it a couple of times while you're taping them so you can listen to it, and then use it to figure out where are they varying from what a native speaker of English would expect them to produce? Okay, so that was probably a lot more than you really wanted to know about pronunciation, but I guarantee you pronunciation is going to be a key part of your work in ESP. Okay, another piece that I want to talk about around language is around the skill of writing. And I want to highlight another theme that continues to come up in our course, and that is the role of sociolinguistic competence, the role of pragmatics. And I think we've moved back and forth on how important it is. I personally think it is one of the most important things that we are teaching in ESP, is how to be appropriate with our language. And even though there's lots and lots of writing that was discovered that police need to produce, it turns out that there are two different kinds. There's very formal writing that probably looks a lot like what your professors at university expect you to do. Very academic, very much matching with kind of mainstream US English use, that kind of thing. But also, there was a more informal use of written English as well. And in this case, it was expected that police would write more the way people talked and the way they talked. And so this is one of those moments where we are basically pulling apart two different kinds of expectations around writing, and this is a place where if the instructor does not focus on sociolinguistic competence, these police students are going to fail. Because if they are using oral language in those formal reports, it will not be acceptable. And if in their informal reports, their language is too academic, it's too far away from the way things were really said, then it won't seem authentic. Because those reports are supposed to capture how people actually expressed ideas. And so we need to catch how they actually expressed it, no matter what form of language they are using. So sociolinguistic competency, again, here it shows up again, highly, highly important. And so I really want to emphasize that as well. Another aspect of language that I wanted to highlight for you from this case is the role of specialist discourse. Now, what does this mean? I want to kind of pull it apart. Specialist discourse, I want to pull it apart. And we've been talking a lot about the language that you hear. For example, the easiest aspect of that is the vocabulary that you hear in a specific environment. And I've got some examples here for you I thought of ahead of time. For example, it took a lot of jobs. I've worked a lot of jobs to get through all my different levels of education. For example, I worked in a bookstore, and if you were to create an ESP course for people working in a bookstore, here's two nouns that would definitely make your list, that you would make sure that we all knew. Books and cashier. But are those truly specialist discourse? Probably not, because in cashier is a word that comes up in a lot of different places. It's not so specialist for just the bookstore. So when we talk about specialist discourse, there's the level of vocabulary that you're hearing over and over again you need to teach, that someone outside of the specialty will have a sense of what it means. But then there's a deeper level of specialist discourse, almost like a restricted language, in which only the people within this profession probably have the same meaning for it. So what's an example from when I worked in the bookstore? We had a monthly pull. What does that mean? That means that when the new magazines came in at the end of a month for the next month, so at the end of April for the new May magazines, we would go through and we would collect all the old magazines and we would record exactly how many came back. And then they were sent to recycling. But we had to report to the magazine companies how much exactly we had sold of their product. We didn't return the product to them, we just let them know. So that's a monthly pull. Books, cashier, not really that kind of restricted language. I also worked in a hotel when I was in graduate school. Bed, bathroom, those are the kinds of languages that you're going to hear someone in housekeeping in a hotel use. But is it truly that restricted language, that kind of specialist discourse? Probably not. What's an example? Housekeeping asset. Housekeeping asset. What does that mean? It means something that the hotel owns that they expect to be able to use again and again, like a towel or an iron, that kind of thing. So that's an example, housekeeping asset. I also worked in a factory every summer when I was in college. And the word machine, that's not really this deeper level of specialist discourse, nor is problem. But both of those would have been words that you'd want to make sure that someone like me knew and could use in English. What is an example of this kind of deeper level of specialist discourse? QC, quality control, but we always called it QC. And so that's an example. And so what about for police? Well, some examples of some vocabulary words that you'd probably make sure that everyone knew. Chase, vehicle, right? But that deeper level of specialist discourse in asking around the word obstruction and the word evading. And one has to do with when you run from the police by foot, and the other has to do with when you run from the police in a vehicle. Evading, I think, is on foot, and obstruction is when you're in a vehicle. So that's an example. And so that's another kind of another dimension for you to think about when you're out there gathering information about language use. What are the nouns that are being used? But also, what's that specialist discourse, that deeper level that even you don't know what it means until you start asking what it means? Like QC, monthly pull, housekeeping, asset, and obstruction. Okay, so, all right. And finally, the last thing that I want to focus on is I want to focus on a decision point that you'll have to make with your ESP classes, and that is whether to present ideas inductively or deductively. So when you're teaching about how language works, do you do it in such a way that you give lots and lots of examples and you let the students figure out what the rule is, and that would be inductive, or do you do it deductively, where you give them the rule and then you have them apply it? And I would say there's no absolute rule for which way to go, but in general, what we find is that for students who have the least amount of formal education and their professional goals are not as high, and maybe even their literacy in their first language is not as strong, often letting them see how it works from the examples rather than beginning with the general rule is often the way to go. And for those who have more education, they often expect and appreciate if you give them the rule and they can apply it. They want effective learning, and they've learned from rules their entire lives. They've learned language that way, they've learned math that way, they've learned science that way. Someone gives them a rule and then they apply it. So it's something to think about. It's and it's something maybe even that you experiment both ways with. Myself, I like often to begin a class with inductive. So I like, for example, to have things up on the board or environmental print up, or everyone's got some strips at their desk, and there's a question like, what do these things have in common? Or what do you notice is the same between these, or something like that. So I often like to begin classes that way. Okay, so those are, in my opinion, these are the big ideas, the key ideas that when I look at this beautiful case around ESP for police, this is what I notice. Okay, read chapter 5. I hope that this makes it very easy to read it. And then from there, take a look at those resources I found that look at the language of police. And then from there, take a look at the pronunciation resources that are waiting for you to see if they might be something you want to use in the future. Okay, and then I'll see you in the discussion.